So we start with a verse for every one of our subjects. So this one's Ephesians 5:31 through 32. For this cause shall a man leave his father and mother, and shall be joined unto his wife, and they two shall be one flesh. This is a great mystery, but I speak concerning Christ and the church. These are the topics that we're going to try to cover in the time that we have. The first, relationship. So we have to go back to Eden whenever we're talking about feminism, and you'll see why. The definition of feminism. And then we'll talk about something that one of the authors of the books that we used calls the lost girls. So the lost girls were the early feminists. And we'll talk about why she considered them to be lost. And then we'll look at the cost of feminism, what it's actually cost our country in the last 176 years that it's been in existence. There's been a terrible price that we've paid. And then we'll talk about repairing the breach. How in the world could we begin the process of fixing what's been broken? So God gave Adam the responsibility to subdue the earth. Not just to tend the garden, but to subdue the entire planet. And so to fill the planet as well. And that mission couldn't be accomplished by himself. You remember in Genesis 2:20, it says, the man gave names to all livestock, and to the birds of the heavens, and to every beast of the field. But for Adam, there was not found a helper fit for him. So God promised that he would give him assistance in the charter that he had given him to look at this untamed planet that was full of animals, full of fauna, full of wildness, to tame that. And so God did exactly that in Genesis 2:23. It says, then the man said, this at last is bone of my bones and flesh of my flesh. She shall be called woman because she was taken out of man. At last, this charter, which includes taming an entire planet, at last I have someone to help me do it. And the word help or helper is often seen as diminutive. So if woman was created to help man or be a helper to man, that's often seen as something that only a lesser person would do. But the word helper, you can see there at the bottom, is ezer in the Hebrew. And that actually means someone who gives assistance in a time of great need. And so that word ezer is used of God in some places in the Old Testament, that God is our help in a time of need. He's our assistance. So Eve did a whole lot more than just carry the water for Adam. Eve was his giver of help in a time of great need. So it's important to remember that, because the current culture wants to paint Eve very differently. Both men and women are made in the image of God. And that's seen clearly in the Genesis account. But of course, men have different characteristics from women and different roles. But a society cannot survive without both. Imagine a society that was only feminine, or a society that was only masculine. So God's intent, his design from the very beginning, was to have feminine and masculine. 1 Corinthians 11 through 12. It says, in the Lord, woman is not independent of man, nor man of woman. For as woman was made from man, so man is now born of woman. And all things are from God. So this perspective tells us that man cannot survive. Masculinity cannot survive without woman, without femininity. And the same is true of woman. We cannot function without each other. We cannot achieve what God is calling us to achieve in this world without each other. And then you hear, when we're talking about masculine and feminine, you often hear people complaining about the word submission. And in Ephesians 5:25, it says, now as the church submits to Christ, so also wives should submit in everything to their husbands. Husbands, love your wives as Christ loved the church and gave himself up for her. So the key with submission is submission has nothing to do with status. Submitting to someone or to something does not change your status. So if men and women are created equal in the image of God, that submission mirrors the submission of Christ to the Father. Christ submitted to the Father all the way to the cross. That does not make him less than the Father. So submission has nothing to do with status. This quote is actually from Rosaria Butterfield's newest book, 5 Lives. And she said, God created men for strength, woman for nurturance, and both for the other. Her submission yielding to his headship, creating the harmony of mutual work and worship of God. So it's not a greater, lesser status whatsoever. But that relationship between Adam and Eve didn't last. And we all know the story. Satan shows up in the garden. He convinces Eve that she can be like God. She can know the difference between good and evil. So Eve takes the fruit, she bites it, she convinces Adam to sin. And as a result, of course, the curse falls on mankind. Part of the curse that applied to Eve is listed here in Genesis 3:16. So the serpent received a curse, Adam received a curse. They were different, they were tailored, right, for the sin that had been committed. But part of Eve's curse is this: your desire shall be contrary to your husband, but he shall rule over you. And John Piper explains this really well in the quote at the bottom there. Contrary desire and corrupted rule are now the norm for marriages under the curse. Instead of submitting to their husbands, wives desire to control them. Instead of lovingly leading their wives, husbands seek to oppress them. Or just give up and give in. This desire to be contrary actually has played out from the garden until today. And that's really what is the root of feminism. So feminism rejects that creation ordinance. It rejects the biblical model that we just talked about. And early feminist efforts, they did in fact do some good things. So looking back at feminism in the 1800s, they engaged on suffrage. So they were protesting for the women to have the vote. They were engaged in the abolition of slavery, so that's also a good thing. And temperance, well, it depends on how you feel about alcohol, but they were engaged in temperance as well. So those were all good things. But as we'll see, feminism was actually diverging from those things early on. And their agenda was much, much broader than just the vote, right, or just equal opportunity. And their goal, their primary goal, is not equal rights, as we said, for men and women, but to erase the vulnerability of women by destroying the patriarchy that oppresses them. The chief goal, as it says on the bottom, is not bettering the lives of women, but making women more like men. So, like with Marxism, going through every wave of feminism would take weeks, and we just don't have the time. So I thought we would focus on first wave feminism, because there's some very interesting characters here. And the metaphor of a wave is often used to describe feminism, and it's a good metaphor because it really has hit our society in successive waves since 1848. And it's important to understand that although they were engaged in some good things, their overall goal didn't change from first wave to fourth wave. And that goal was the destruction of the patriarchy. Carrie Gress mentions in The End of Woman this concept of the lost girls. And they're lost from the perspective of the trauma that they suffered. 3 of these women that we'll talk about in first wave feminism went through serious parental abuse, sexual trauma, drug use, mental illness, all kinds of issues. Mary Wollstonecraft was the first feminist, lived in England. Feminism wasn't an ism quite yet, but she advocated for all the different aspects of feminism. So she grew up in an abusive home. Her father was alcoholic. He beat her mother incessantly. And Mary eventually, as a young woman, attempted suicide twice. And she died fairly young. She died just after giving birth. So she had a very difficult life, some of which was tied to the abuse of men, but some of which was tied to her own terrible choices. And then Mary Godwin Shelley was her daughter. And so when Mary was born, as she began to grow up, she knew that her birth had been the cause of her mother's death. And her father was resentful about that. They lived in a big rambling house, and she essentially raised herself. She was left alone. And this is heartbreaking. She first learned to write words by tracing the letters on her mother's tombstone. And then Elizabeth Cady Stanton was the first American feminist. And her father really wanted a boy, so when she was born, he lamented that fact incessantly. And she resolved to do everything that a boy could do. So that was her young life, was attempting to outdo her brothers and everyone else. She also had some other disturbing habits, but this is an important concept because feminism wasn't born in a vacuum. There was abuse taking place against women. Women did not have equal rights. Women were not able to vote. There were all these things that needed to be resolved in society. But feminism threw the baby out with the bathwater and everything else. So the entire Genesis mandate. So it's interesting to look back at the trauma, but the response to the trauma is what caused the problem that we see today. So this is Mary Wollstonecraft. As I said, the first feminist. She sought to destroy the tyranny of men. She was a very interesting person. She knew Thomas Paine. He was actually a mentor. He helped her to decide to write, and he helped her to learn how to write. She actually visited France during the French Revolution, had a relationship with a man, got pregnant out of wedlock, and barely escaped with her life as the French were beginning to behead everyone who wasn't egalitarian enough. And when she wrote the book, A Vindication of the Rights of Woman, that's where she really laid out the structure of what feminism would become. And her fundamental goal there was to restructure all of society, to do away with male hierarchy, do away with the patriarchy entirely. And though in 1796 she met William Godwin, and he was an avowed anarchist. He had a very interesting home. He would invite anarchists and other ne'er-do-wells to come and visit. He saw marriage as terrible, odious, the enemy of good. But when Mary became pregnant, he decided, well, we don't want the child to be born out of wedlock. So they got married. And immediately after being married, they moved into separate houses because they wanted to consider their free love, their open marriage, their doing whatever they wanted to do. That was another part of Mary's book, the advocation of free love. So their daughter was born in 1797, actually not long after they were married. And then Mary died 10 days after giving birth from an infection. So her daughter, Mary Godwin Shelley, most people recognize the name from the book Frankenstein. But Mary had a very difficult life, and a lot of it was Mary's choices that caused it. But as I've said, after the death of her mother, she grew up with her father. William Godwin hosted some very interesting people. He even brought in Aaron Burr. So remember, after Aaron Burr's duel with Alexander Hamilton and killing Alexander Hamilton, he went and visited with William Godwin. So Mary got a chance to talk to him. And then a poet, Percy Bysshe Shelley. So if you love poetry, you probably recognize that name. So Percy fell in love with Mary. She was only 16, but he decided he wanted to run away with her. He didn't inform his wife before he did that. And eventually his wife committed suicide. She felt abandoned and horrified, as she should have. And then All but one of the 4 children that Percy and Mary had died young. So a very difficult life. So they both advocated free love. They both hated marriage. Their narcissism and that ideology, it really kind of created a trail of broken lives. There were a lot of people that were hurt by them, including her sister Fanny, who fell in love with Percy and eventually killed herself. So as she was writing Frankenstein, Percy was writing about Prometheus. And it was a similar kind of a character they were both writing about. And a similar theme, which is man can create things without God. Man doesn't need God to excel. And ironically, the character, Frankenstein, not Dr. Frankenstein, but the monster, ended very poorly because you can't create without God. You can't live without God. So Mary didn't really learn the lesson of her own creation. So the first American feminist, Elizabeth Cady Stanton. Stanton and Susan B. Anthony were actually seen as co-founders. Susan was the speaker. She was the face of feminism. But Elizabeth Cady Stanton was the brains behind feminism. She did all the writing. She did all the thinking, the strategizing. And because she was married with multiple kids, she couldn't travel the way that Susan could. And she kind of resented that. She hated married life. She hated domesticity. She hated having to watch the kids. And it came out in some of her writings. She was the primary organizer for the very first feminist event, and that was called the Seneca Falls Convention in July of 1848. So Seneca Falls, New York. And then, as we said, she had a difficult upbringing. Her father was a lawyer. She used to go into his law offices and take the books off the shelf. And every law she saw that was oppressive to women, she would take scissors and cut it out, as if she thought that would stop the law from being enacted. She eventually married an abolitionist, Henry Stanton, and she did participate in the early abolition movement. So you remember the Second Great Awakening wraps up near the early 1900s. Early 1800s. And then, not quite 50 years later, you have this surge of new movements springing up. So out of the Second Great Awakening, Mormonism was actually born. Adventism was born. Several other movements were born in that same part of New York, right? Seneca Falls area, which was unusual in and of itself because the Second Great Awakening was a Christian revival. But there was a lot of spiritual activity, for sure, in that region. And spiritualism took root in about 1848. So that really was a focus on the supernatural, a focus on communicating with the dead. It was born, oddly, again, it was born in the Burned Over District. The Burned Over District was that part of upstate New York where the Second Great Awakening had its largest impact. So in an area where a revival has its largest impact, you see these occultish movements spring up 50 years later. And so the Burned Over District is where spiritualism got its start. And ironically, feminism began in Seneca Falls at that convention, where spiritualism began, maybe 50 miles away in Hydesville, New York. So they're both starting up at the same time. And it's interesting because advocates of spiritualism also embraced feminism, and advocates of feminism embraced spiritualism. And so Elizabeth Cady Stanton said that she had heard spirit raps. So this was the beginning of spiritualism, included knocking and rapping on doors and tables, supposedly the dead communicating with the living. So Elizabeth Cady Stanton admitted that she heard that in her home. And she had a visitor, after she made that comment, a visitor came in and confirmed it. And the women who were planning that feminist conference, the Seneca Falls Convention, actually chose a parlor in a home where those spirit rappings were heard on purpose, as they're debating what should be in their Declaration of Independence. And they even used the table where those rappings were heard, where people were communicating with the dead. And when they wrote the Feminist Declaration of Rights and Sentiments, it was written on purpose on that table. So that table is now in the Smithsonian. You won't see the context of spiritualism or spirit wrappings or anything like that on it, but it's still there. So here, Elizabeth Cady Stanton's propensity to take scissors to books really came in. And when the Revised Version of the Bible was published, it was published in 3 releases, 1881, 1885, and then 1894. After that last publishing, she felt that it did not exalt and dignify women, so it had to be changed. So she created a revising committee. So that's a revising committee to revise the revised version of the Bible. And the committee, of course, had no biblical scholars on it. They just wanted to rewrite and reinterpret the Bible according to feminist ideals. So that was released. It was called the Woman's Bible, and it was released in 1895. And so, of course, it depicted Eve as a heroine, Satan as a wise counselor. With no sin, there's no need for a savior, so there's no savior in there. Eventually, she was disavowed by the suffrage groups for doing that, because they just simply weren't going to tolerate that kind of behavior. Skip ahead just a few years, the 1920s, Margaret Sanger. So you know Margaret Sanger from Planned Parenthood. She's the founder. She was actually the founder of the organizations that became Planned Parenthood. And she was, again, a first-wave feminist. Her focus was different. So she really did want birth control to be countrywide. But that desire for birth control had nothing to do with the benefit of women. She was a eugenics believer. And at that point in the country, eugenics was huge. It was taught in universities, it was taught in medical schools. We need to re-engineer the human race. We need to take some genetic features out, keep some in. And so she said she was going to discourage the over-fertility of the mentally and physically defective. Of course, she got to choose who was mentally and physically defective. And then it's not right to say she was an abortion advocate. She advocated for abortion on demand and birth control for women that were not of desirable stock. So women who had kids who were mentally or physically disabled, or kids who became criminals, or you name it. So she discouraged abortion for women that were of desirable stock. So this is straight up Nazi-esque eugenics. And here's the most unusual part. After World War II, she actually sought out the population minister for the Third Reich, the man responsible for eugenics for the Nazis, coming up with the laws, forced sterilization laws, those kind of things. She sought that man out and placed him in charge of International Planned Parenthood. She wanted him to help build the structure for Planned Parenthood. So not just Nazism, feminism has been linked to communism as well. And it's a pretty solid link. You remember in the 1920s and 30s, the American Communist Party was huge. And after the Great Depression, a lot of people joined the Communist Party. And they began to infiltrate U.S. institutions. There were several notable trials. So you remember McCarthyism wasn't born in a vacuum either. McCarthyism was born because there were, in fact, Soviet spies in U.S. government offices. They just kind of went overboard in tracking them down. But the Congress of American Women was actually formed in that era, and its goal was to advance the Soviet perspective among women in the U.S. And so it was destruction of the nuclear family, women in the workforce, not in the home, children raised in government-operated daycare facilities, which were in fact indoctrination facilities, and then unlimited abortions. And Betty Friedan, who was the first second-wave feminist, was a part of this organization until McCarthy's committee, the House Un-American Activities Committee, identified this group as a Soviet front and shut it down. They disbanded it in 1949. So skip ahead a few years, 1963, and based on all the statistics, women were clearly unhappy. And if you read Eve in Exile, Rebecca Merkel does a good job of describing the 50s and how the 50s turned into the 60s and why women were so unhappy. But 21% of women in 1963 were on psychotropic medications. So there was profound discontent in the 60s. And Betty Friedan, who was a part of the communist group back in 1949, authored a book, The Feminine Mystique. That book kicked off second wave feminism. That book is what actually took feminism into the mainstream. Women read it. It sold millions of copies in the 60s. And in the book, of course, everything you saw in the communist-affiliated organization, you saw in the book, right? So women should be in a career. They shouldn't be at home. That was not going to help them be fulfilled. So the focus changed from the family and service to self-fulfillment. And then by the 80s, this ideal was so common that you never saw a commercial of a homemaker. All the commercials were young career women, right? And so churches in this era were also impacted. So mainline denomination churches were actually bringing women in droves. They were elevating women to positions of authority and power, not based on scripture. Obviously, those authority roles were unbiblical. What is the cost? So we can't go any deeper into feminism. There, like I said, there are at least 3 or 4 additional classes where we could cover all of it. But the cost of feminism has been huge. Over the last 51 years, 63 million children have been killed. So if you look at the global statistics for abortion over the last 51 years, it just makes you weep. But within our country alone, the impact of lost life. And then fourth wave feminism, which exists today. So the transgender movement and fourth wave feminism are linked together at the hip. And if you're wondering why biological males aren't being called out by feminists, why biological males in sports and swimming and volleyball aren't being called out, and that women aren't being protected, it's because fourth wave feminism will not protect women. That is not its goal. It sees transgender rights as the fundamental struggle of this era. So it's going to support transgender people. And then I didn't put the stats here, but female suicide, depression, anxiety, drug use, those are all through the roof. And this is the most disturbing stat for me. The U.S. marriage rate has declined 60% in the last 5 decades. So that beautiful one flesh arrangement between Adam and Eve, between men and women in marriage, that arrangement that reflects Christ and the church, is now declining so badly. So the trend now is not to marry. Young women are not seeking marriage, and now young men are very disaffected, and they aren't either. And then the concept of toxic masculinity has really hurt. And that concept within feminism that all masculinity is toxic, of course, is contrary to Scripture, because we saw the need for both femininity and masculinity. But it's definitely destroyed relationships. Men are more likely to be homeless, imprisoned, drug addicted, and to commit suicide. And the dropout rate in schools for men is through the roof. So feminism has had a horrific impact in our society. So how do we repair the breach? This is our last slide. I love this picture. It looks like it's in London, maybe after a bombing run by the Nazis, and this young woman is up there trying to put bricks back into the wall. How do we repair a breach in the wall? And feminism has caused that breach. And the point that Carrie Gress makes, and Rebecca Merkel too in their books, is that women are the best equipped to repair this breach. Everything that has been destroyed by feminism can be rebuilt. monogamous marriage, the nuclear family, valuing motherhood, valuing children. And then the relationship between men and women has got to be repaired as well. As I said in Genesis, we cannot live without each other. God made us to be complementary. So that has to be repaired. And then every woman is in a different place. So not every woman is childbearing age. Some older women, younger women, women that are gifted with singleness, women that are married, women that are raising kids. So every woman is different, but her God-given gifting and calling is not. So creating beauty, creating relationships, knitting people together, building a home that's warm and inviting, loving their family. I mean, those giftings and callings don't change. And every time a woman uses that gift and that calling, it helps put another brick back into the breach, back into the wall that's been destroyed by feminism.